everyone, and welcome to another fantastic IHC webinar. I am Kate Bridle, your IHC host, and I am thrilled to have you here with us today. Thank you for spending your breakfast, lunchtime, dinner time, whatever time it may be for you with us. We appreciate having you here. And special thanks to our wonderful sponsor, Juro, thanks to whom this session is free for all of you. We love giving you a free CLE. And thank you to our awesome presenter today, Michael Haynes, who is going to teach us how to build contract playbooks that actually work, which sounds very useful, so I'm excited to hear about it. Please let me know that you can see me and hear me by putting your name in the chat. You can also put your bio, where you are, what the weather is, whatever you like in there. Use it to get to know each other. This is, if you can believe it, our 121st event of the year. I guess we're almost to the end of the year, and I'm going to have to reset this count. But I want to know if you are here for the first time with us or if you are a repeat vendor. And for today's event, as I said, it is about how to build contract playbooks, presented to us by the fantastic Michael Haynes. Michael is the general counsel at Juro, bringing over a decade of legal expertise to the team. Since joining in 2022, he has led Juro's legal function, supporting the platform's mission to empower businesses with intelligent contract automation. So he knows all about contract playbooks, and I will hand things over to him without further ado. Michael, take it away.
Brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, nice to meet you, everyone. As Kate mentioned, I'm general counsel at Juro. We're an intelligent contract automation company. So we do a lot of work with contract playbooks across all of our customers. I've also spent about the last kind of 7 or 8 months embedded in AI agents team working on how to make all this stuff work in the AI era. So how do you make an AI redlining tool follow a playbook? So hopefully I can show you some interesting stuff. What are we going to talk about? So we'll start quite basics to talk about the components of a great playbook, how to build out a very traditional looking playbook for contract negotiations. The second thing we'll talk about is like how that's changing in the AI era. So things you need to bear in mind as you build contract playbooks to be used for both people and AI. And the third thing, we're going to talk about how to operationalize those playbooks. So how to put them into practice, how to make them impossible not to follow. And then we'll finish with some live Q&A. I will do my best to keep an eye on the chat as we go through, but if I don't spot your question, then I'm hoping Kate will pick me up on it as we go through. You might also tell by my accent that I'm not based in North America. I'm here in a very dark evening in Scotland, but it's quite nice and clear and cold. So yeah, keep telling me where you're all dialing in from, because it certainly sounds like there's some nice warm destinations that I might go over and see at some point. So a bit of housekeeping. There aren't any polls in this webinar except for one that we'll ask you at the very end. So please stick around for that one. Feel free to ask questions in the chat, as we've said. And we've also got a handy one-pager that we can share with you after this webinar that will include some of the information that I will talk about. And then, like all good presentations to lawyers, there is a disclaimer at the bottom. I'm not giving you legal advice. Pop in the chat anyone who knows who this guy is. I'd be interested to see if we've got any Bengals fans in the house. I'm going to give it 2 or 3 seconds for you to let me know if anyone knows who he is. If you don't, there's a guy called Paul Brown. Now, playbooks are a thing in football, or American football as we call it, because of this guy, basically. So he started off with his high school team and basically was the first coach to go through the motions of building out regular, repeatable plays that he would train out to his players. And they were basically drilled in those plays. And he revolutionized the way that football was played. So he look in the NFL now, every team is following a playbook. And his mantra was this, which is to leave as little to chance as possible. Preparation is the key to success. And contract playbooks are very similar. We're a long way behind professional football teams, however. So I'm going to talk a little bit through about how those same principles that he brought to sport are actually quite relevant to what we do as in-house lawyers. For those who are not familiar with contract playbooks, they are a structured guide on how to handle contract negotiations. You generally have one of 3 aims. So one might be consistency. So you want to negotiate the same points in the same way across multiple contracts. The second is speed. You want to get quicker at doing negotiations. So you don't want to slow down your business functions from closing deals just because you're trying to reinvent the wheel every time you negotiate a contract. And the third is you might want to delegate more. That might be to a junior attorney in your team. It might be actually to enable other business units to self-serve, or and we'll get on to talking about this, it might be delegating to a machine to do that job for you. But ultimately, people who deploy playbooks do it for one of these three reasons. The one thing I would add, though, is that whatever the motivation for building a playbook, you should definitely measure whether you're succeeding in that motivation. So if your objective is to bring speed to contract negotiations, you ought to be benchmarking, right? So thinking about measuring something, and that might be the time between contract terms to start with and the time after you roll out your playbook. And what you will do is you will find that your playbook does one of three things, right? It either makes you faster, it might slow you down, or it might have no impact at all. And it's very important to understand that the impact that it's having, because a playbook is ultimately a tool to achieve an outcome. And so unless you're achieving that outcome, your playbook is not succeeding. So I would have a look at that. And that outcome might be very different for different types of businesses. So if you are a massive corporation with huge bargaining power, then consistency might be more important to you than the other things. If you are a small hyper growth startup, then speed might be the most important thing to you. And if you are a senior lawyer just drowning in work and you want to be able to get more onto the plate of people who are either more junior or not in your team, then delegation might be the most important. But whatever the motivator, measure it and then measure whether you're getting better at it or not as a result of your playbook. Playbooks generally suit repeated negotiated transactions. So that basically means they are suitable for the kind of commoditized agreement that we see lots of and are negotiated in relatively standardized ways. So confidentiality agreements or non-disclosure agreements are a really good example. Data processing agreements that you see a lot in kind of software businesses and things like that. And sales contracts, right? Really suitable use cases. So the things you come across day after day in your role as an in-house lawyer. Unsuitable question mark might be some of these like more bespoke transactions, right? Or less negotiated transactions. So employment contracts or IP assignment agreements with employees, those things tend to be unsuitable for a playbook. You might invest a lot of time building a playbook, but if no one ever negotiates the document, then that may be wasted effort. Big projects like mergers and acquisitions or fundraising, the kind of almost once in a lifetime thing that you might go through as a business. I put a question mark against that because if your business is in the business of doing, for example, roll-ups, so buying multiple businesses and leveraging technology and efficiencies to make those businesses run better, then you might well have an M&A playbook. But most businesses, most operating businesses wouldn't get to a stage where the investment in time to make one is worth it. And other bespoke things, so things you come across once, twice a year, may not be suitable for building a playbook. There are definitely other things here that I haven't mentioned. Say vendor contracts would be a really good example of a suitable type of transaction that would merit a playbook being built. And normally you'll need a playbook for each contract type. This is an example from our own playbook library at Juro, but we've got actually multiple different playbook types for different master services agreements, so how we sell Juro to our customers, but also for non-disclosure agreements as well. And generally you would have one playbook for each kind of type of contract or type of transaction that you're doing. And sometimes you'll need many playbooks for each contract type. So one example would be like vendor contracts. I think if you try to do lots and lots of different types of vendor contracts within one playbook, you can end up with an unmanageable level of complexity and length and detail that makes it very difficult to follow and very difficult to keep up to date and maintained. Within vendor contracts, for example, you might have one playbook for buying physical goods. You have to order parts for your product. You might have a playbook for how you do that. Software and technology, those generally tend to fall together. So your software as a service playbook, or your software license playbook, or you're buying a piece of tech, that would be in one place as well. And you might have other services, so consulting, things like that, where people step into your business for a short period of time. The issues you come across tend to differ quite a lot between those categories of vendor contracts. And so I would try to break them down to that level of granularity so that you can make them not too unwieldy to use. And you might also have separate playbooks for ancillary documents to the same transactions. So you might, for example, have a separate data processing agreement playbook or a service level agreement playbook, whatever, those ancillary documents that get bolted on to a lot of other transactions that you do. might be best served by having their own instructions for how to deal with them. But in 2025, you should be building your playbooks not just for humans, so the people in your team you delegate to and the people outside your team that you delegate to, but you should be starting to think about how that knowledge can be transferred and used for AI. So whether your business is at that stage yet or not, the world is moving pretty fast, right? And it will not be long, if you're not doing it already, before your teams will be starting to experiment with how they use AI to review and mark up contracts. And the role of a playbook in like building out standardized processes, standardized positions is going to be increasingly important. And actually, the legal teams that have got playbooks in place already for lots of the commercial contracts they do are effectively have a head start in using AI because ultimately nearly every AI tool on the market, you need to tell it what to do, right? So you need to say that this is a vendor contract for a SaaS subscription agreement. You need to review it and mark it up in accordance with our preferences. And having those preferences documented in a playbook is incredibly useful. So before we move on to how AI is changing the world when it comes to playbooks, I think it's probably worth just taking a step back to something a little bit more basic and thinking about the core components of what a playbook might look like. I tend to split my playbooks into kind of maybe 4 or 5 different fields for each point, and I'll talk through these fields in a little bit more detail in the next few minutes. But generally, they fall across these categories of clause identification, preferred position, so the optimum position you want to achieve, fallback position, escalation guidelines, what approvals are required for certain things, so whether that's retreating to a fallback position, whether that's agreeing an off playbook position, something that's not been done before. And the commentary and rationale point is extremely useful, particularly if you've got junior lawyers or AI using your playbook. So explaining why the rule exists. And that basically builds in an element of flexibility. So building in the ability for your team members to take rational decisions and apply judgment in applying the playbook. So let's take a look at those in a little bit more detail. Clause identification. So this is a thing I put in all my playbooks, but it basically is about giving each type of clause a label and explaining what it's about, right? So this example here on the left is talking about a service standard clause. Those clauses we're all used to seeing. The vendor must provide the services with reasonable skill and care, that kind of thing. So what I've done here is I've got a label here, say service standard. That's what I've chosen to call it. And then I'm describing what that clause does. And the reason for the description is important, right? Because unless you are dealing with your first party standard terms on which you sell your product or service, generally people don't call their clauses the same thing in every contract. And so you need some kind of general objective description by which either the user or a machine can work out what it is you're talking about when you're describing a service standard clause. And so this includes a short description to help the user or AI identify the particular clause it is that you are talking about. Next, you have a preferred position. Now, there's a kind of philosophical debate about whether contract negotiation is about winning or whether it's about agreeing. I think that can also be a bit cultural, right, as well. So you might be in a space or in a jurisdiction where contract negotiations are more adversarial, or you might be in one where they're maybe a little bit more collaborative. Either way, it can help to have an idea of what your optimum position is with any particular negotiation and on any particular point. So yeah, this is the chance in your playbook to explain what your preferred position is and to give examples. So the example here on the left is a pretty onerous provision for the vendor. But as a customer using this playbook, it might be my preferred position that my vendor commits to providing services with highest standards of skill, care, and diligence and in accordance with best industry practice. Now, and then including an example of how that drafting might look is very useful because it helps either another member of your team or someone outside your team identify whether the clause that they're reviewing complies with that preferred position or not. Now, it seems pretty obvious, right, from this example, because the example is very similar to the description of the position. But we'll talk a little bit more about why sample language and sample historic kind of agreed terms are very useful when we get on to talking about the changes that we see in the kind of AI era. And then fallback positions, right? So you might have one or more levels of fallback that you want to permit whoever it is that's using your playbook to agree in order to negotiate and agree the contract. So this is a kind of what's the minimum acceptable position? What stages do you want to go through to get there? You should also, with this, explain any escalations or approvals required to use those positions. So there's a mixture of substance, so what is the acceptable position, and process. So how is a user meant to get to the fallback position that you described? In this example, you can see we've got all of those elements. So description of the acceptable position, so reasonable skill, care, and diligence in accordance with good industry practice. We've got an example, sample drafting. That might be from an agreement we've done before. It might be just dummy language that we use to describe what that position is. And then we've got at the bottom a statement about what approvals are required or not to use the fallback. So what freedom does the person using the playbook have to negotiate? And then red lines is another thing you might wish to have in your playbook. I don't tend to include this in mine, but there might be particular points where it is possible for the counterparty to do things that are so offensive that you don't want them to be crossed. And so it's often very helpful to call out positions that would definitely be unacceptable. This example, to take this further, right, would say that the contract doesn't include any objective standard for measuring the vendor's performance of the service. If I'm a customer, I might want to at least commit my vendor to some standard that isn't tied to a specific metric in the contract to cover those gaps between things that we might negotiate and agree. And here I might say not doing that is a completely unacceptable position. And so you want to be very clear with your users or with your machine that you're using that those positions are unacceptable. Because if you are not clear, then there is a chance that you can use the playbook and still end up agreeing a position that is unacceptable. So a mixture of positives, so the things we definitely are okay agreeing, or the things we are happy to agree, and the negative, right? Things we definitely do not want to agree, gives a more fulsome picture, more fulsome context to someone using your playbook. I debated what to call this slide. I went for red lines in the end, but I realized that was going to be slightly confusing in a legal presentation. So I have clarified that I do not mean red lines, red space lines. And then finally, a bit of commentary and rationale. So this, as I mentioned, is explaining to the user or to the machine why you take the approach in the playbook. And what this does is builds in the ability for the user to explain to the counterparty what's going on, and also helps build in flexibility. If there is a compromise position proposed that isn't explicitly covered by your preferred or fallback positions, it can help the user in that escalation process to explain the proposal that's been made by the other side and why that may or may not be acceptable. So I generally include this kind of notes section, which is a little bit like a kind of textbook on contract negotiation, but it will generally talk about the rationale for why a particular clause is the way it is in the playbook. So here you've got an explanation for why, for example, I tend to push vendors to provide some objective service standard to fill gaps left by specific targets in the contract, and the consequence of not including that. So it being particularly difficult to prove a breach of contract if the services are poor, but there's no particular metric or milestone set out in your contract. So that commentary and rationale bit is very useful. You might then also have some advanced playbook features. Now, the table that I showed at the start was super slimmed down, suits very commoditized, low risk contracts. But you might also want to give a little bit more context to the person using your playbook. And so things like you might have a priority scoring system or a weighting or a risk rating or something like that. Those things can be useful, but aren't necessary, but they can help to operationalize your playbook. If you articulate in your playbook positions that are unacceptable for the liability clause, and you articulate positions that are unacceptable for payment terms, those two are not necessarily equal, right? And so things like a priority or risk rating can really help you contextualize the ask that you're making of the other side, and might also facilitate flexibility where you need it in future. So you might, for example, have a lower level of approval required to deviate from your playbook if the risk rating is medium versus if the risk rating is high. And so that those kind of advanced features help you start to operationalize your playbook and build in processes that actually take into account the relative level of risk that you're talking about. Playbooks are, however, operating systems and not just documents. I think there's a risk that as document focused lawyers, we can look at these things and think that the task is to prepare a document that people will read that describes what to do in negotiations. And actually, that's the wrong way to look at it. Playbooks are definitely operating systems for your business, not even just your legal team, because they are living things, right? And so they need user testing, installation, regular maintenance, just like any other operating system. So user testing, like the best advice I can give here is to build a minimum viable product, ship it, and find out what works. Many times I've made the mistake of trying to build a playbook that is complete or comprehensive or perfect before you start using it. And actually, the best feedback you can get is from very early adopters of your system, and they will tell you things that don't work, and you can address those as you are building. And it's often better to do that as you're building rather than wait to have something that's completely comprehensive for every situation. You might also find situations that you didn't imagine would exist that you need to legislate for. You might also find that some things you were spending ages agonizing about how you draft that in the playbook don't actually arise in practice. And my kind of one tip there is to treat it like a software developer would building a product. Build something that barely works and put it out into the wild and see how it works and learn from it. The second is like installation. Don't let it live in a document only. Make it impossible not to use it. So that's encouraging you as the lawyer to think about how you systematize your playbook. If your playbook is a Word document that lives on an intranet page somewhere that only the legal team uses, that may not be the best way to make sure that everyone follows it. And this doesn't require like a huge level of technical knowledge. It might just require some very simple automations or some very simple steps in a sales process that you can implement in your sales team CRM or something like that that will make it very difficult not to follow the playbook. So the playbook is very important because it's an articulation of policy, but the systemization of it is much, much more important, particularly as you get to reaching more users in your business. And then maintenance. Over time and over surprisingly little time, you will realize that there are issues in your playbook. So there will be positions where you've taken too firm an approach. There will be positions where you realized you made a mistake and things broke and you didn't get the positions you wanted. That's okay. Each one of those opportunities is a learning experience, but the best thing you can do is look at your playbook, identify where it needs to change and make those changes, and also look at the way it's deployed. And is the playbook existing in an area where people can't access it or people can't use it, or it's not where people do their work? If you find those problems that lead to low adoption, my advice is to change, right? And make it user friendly. This is not about being friendly to the lawyer who built the playbook. It's about being very friendly to the people who use it. And only through doing that will you be able to get the adoption you need to actually achieve the objectives that you set yourself, whether that's consistency, speed, or delegation. User testing. We spoke a little bit about this. So yeah, ship a playbook fast and early. Don't wait for perfection to find out what you've done wrong. User testing generally goes in three phases in software development. I tend to run my playbook testing phases in the same way. So start with your alpha phase, right? So a minimum viable product. Pick low-hanging fruit and work with a champion. So it's often tempting to look at your biggest, most difficult problem in the legal function with contracts and try to solve that with a playbook first. My advice would be don't do that. So pick something that's easy to solve first and show people the value that comes from it before trying to bite off a more difficult project. So you might be looking, say, my sales contract is the thing where the sales team really needs enabling to negotiate or enabling to close deals more easily, and the legals is holding it up. But you might look at that and think, you know what, I'm gonna start by just addressing the NDA they use at the start of the sales process rather than trying to pick off the big meaty contract first. The second stage of kind of software development once it's out in the wild is a beta, right? So trying to broaden your user base. Get input from more users as you build. So you might start with one champion in the sales team who is testing your playbook and using it to negotiate easy legal points to save time for you and your team. But at some point, you're going to need to expand your user base beyond that champion. So think about how you expand that pool in a way that is like incremental but meaningful. The more input you get from more people, the better your playbook will be as you build it and finalize it. And then launch, right? Tweak based on that feedback and put your playbook into general availability. Once you've got that NDA playbook up and running, launch it to the whole sales team and let them use it. And that at that point, you start delivering real value. And then I think once you've done that kind of early low hanging fruit, go back and pick a more difficult problem to solve, another playbook, whatever, and repeat the process again. That installation point, I think I mentioned it. I think substance is generally more important than form when it comes to playbooks. So covering the right stuff, having the right positions. But as you roll out these systems and processes to more people, form becomes more important. And you generally need to operate and live where your users live. But that doesn't mean you need to be in that state to start with. Start scrappy. So a Google Doc or a Notion page or a Word document in an intranet might be the right place to start, something that's very easy to build. And if you're trialing this with one champion, that's very easy to manage. And that's totally okay, completely fine. And it can look as rough as this example here, and that's no problem whatsoever. Refine as you roll out to more users and you implement feedback from those users, you might start to think about how you do structured training. So, like, how do you teach a sales team to use the playbook in a way that enables them to close deals quicker? How do you teach junior members of your team to use the playbook to negotiate more independently? That kind of structured training can be very useful once you hit that point of critical scale. And then the later stage is real operationalization, right? So building your playbook into systems and automation. This is a slightly biased example that I've got on the page because this is Juro's own playbook function for its AI contract review and redlining tool. You might be at that stage in your business where you've got a playbook, you've got a few people using it, but actually you just want to make it easier for them to use, right? So you might at that stage start saying, you know what, I'm going to buy a system. It might be Juro, it might be something else. That's fine. It might be an existing system that you've got in your business. But at that point, you'd be starting to look about how you can reduce friction as much as possible for your users to increase adoption. And then maintenance, yeah, like I said, playbooks are living systems. They're not static documents. So you use them to learn, refine, and remove friction from your contracting processes. There's a few things, right? So updates to terms require updates to playbooks. It feels like that might be like duplicating work, but actually it's one of those things where a little bit of investment upfront pays dividends over the long term. Second, start tracking where you find that your playbook deviates from the market. You might find that you take a particularly hard position on certain points. That's okay, but make sure that's deliberate, right? So if you are taking a position that deviates from market practice, it's useful to explain why you take that position in your playbook. That will help whoever's using it to negotiate those points. Or, and this is quite a common thing that I do, right, is like you might find that the same point gets pulled up in 3 or 4 out of 10 negotiations. At that point, you've really got to assess whether the juice is worth the squeeze when it comes to negotiating, right? And it's your job as the kind of person responsible for making sure these deals get closed and in a way that manages risk in the right way, balances the growth of your business against the legal risks you're trying to mitigate. You might look at that and say, you know what, I can take a softer position that will remove half those negotiations. Those incremental wins are very important. And like I said, yeah, just remove those unnecessary friction points. If you find that you're negotiating the same point time after time and it's on a point that you don't really care about, I would encourage you to remove it from your terms. Like, I think when it comes to terms, there's a real risk of kind of garbage in, garbage out with these processes. So it's if you find that there are particular points in your terms that are causing your customers or your particular points in your playbook that are causing your vendors challenges, think about how to address those. But what playbooks do, if you're monitoring the types of clauses that are negotiated, is they start to give you an atlas, right? So you can start to identify the particular points that you might want to focus your updates on. And that really can start unlocking some serious velocity from the legal team, which I think there are very few opportunities as a lawyer to really accelerate the way that your business operates. But this is one of them, and I strongly recommend taking it where you can. So I'm just going to pause there. This stuff that I've spoken about so far is really nothing that new. This process of building structured playbooks that humans can read and that require testing, installation, maintenance, that's not really new, right? I could have sat here 5 to 10 years ago and told you the same stuff. But what I'm going to talk about next is how playbooks need to change for the AI era. This is mainly about making your playbooks work just as well for large language models or LLMs as they do for humans using them. And this is a really fine balance to start to strike. And actually, challenge here is the pace of change of the technology. You will find that certain things that worked for you when you were using the last edition of Gemini now no longer work when Gemini 3 comes out. And that's just the reality of the world in which we're living, right? The technology is moving so fast. But I'm hoping that some of the tips I share now from months of experience of being embedded with an agentic team building these products will help you in starting that process. These tips are designed to be agnostic about the platform you're using as well. So you might be using an enterprise version of ChatGPT, you might be using Claude, you might be using Gemini, you might be using a specialist legal AI tool. But these tips I find are generally applicable. Some things will work better with some platforms than others, but I hope they're useful anyway. The first point I would make is that context becomes critical. LLMs, while extremely knowledgeable from being trained on petabytes of publicly available data, are very highly sophisticated. They don't have the context of your transaction. They don't have the context of your business. They don't have the context of the particular thing you are trying to do or the particular commercial objectives you are trying to achieve. And that context starts to become critical for getting useful output. And so, in a way that perhaps you would not have told a human, you need to tell AI what each playbook is for and things like which side you are on. This is obvious when you're the junior lawyer in the team picking up a contract and looking at the playbook, but nothing is obvious to an LLM. So this example down the bottom here, I might have a note at the top of my playbook, which I wouldn't necessarily include for a human. This is a playbook for use by the Juro sales team to use when reviewing comments from a customer on our standard US Master Services Agreement. You act for Juro. Very simple, but actually those two sentences might improve your accuracy and of your output by many percentage points. It's very useful to set that context, which feels obvious when you're writing it, but is not entirely obvious to an LLM that's coming to this thing cold. The second thing is to use a structured format, just as you would do with a human readable playbook, sorry, but to avoid rich text and features that are basically designed for human eyes to read. So this can include things like tables. My playbooks were always traditionally in tables. I've had hours of fun removing them from tables to make them more easily readable by AI. Formatting for emphasis. If you use bold and italics to emphasize a point in your notes, that emphasis won't come across to an LLM reading your notes. Styles, so the various styles you get in Microsoft Word, headers, heading 1, heading 2, body text, all that kind of stuff. Very difficult for an LLM to read. Pictures probably are quite rare in playbooks anyway, but avoid them. And things like emojis as well. I was very guilty of using emojis quite a lot in my playbooks that were designed for humans. And it's far better to say unacceptable rather than include the red cross emoji like I've got here on the slide. You also need to be very specific and literal for a playbook to be usable by AI. Vague language is very difficult for AI to interpret. I think of that in a couple of ways. So one is using very specific language, very clear thresholds, the same keywords when the same thing, and avoiding using legal jargon where I can. Some of the things I've discovered that AI really struggles with are things like ranges. If we hit the example, accept a liability cap of 1 to 3 times annual fees, the LLM will really struggle to pick what the answer should be. So if you've got an AI review tool and you said 1 to 3 times annual fees is okay, it's going to not be able to handle that level of discretion. Pick one, like I have done in the example at the bottom left. But also, I think the really interesting thing about building AI tools that do this job for lawyers is actually finding out that my drafting, my language, the way I instruct people in a playbook was really not as clear as I thought it was. And so actually, the testing your playbook on AI can really improve the clarity and readability for humans as well at the same time. So it's definitely not a wasted effort. You need to list clause triggers and keywords. This clause identification challenge that we've spoken about already is very difficult for AI. So AI has within its kind of training data many examples of each clause type, but it won't necessarily associate all forms of wording for that clause with it being clause type A. The more examples you can give the AI in your playbook, the better. So you might actually, in a world where where previously you had one example of a limitation of liability clause for the customer, you might benefit from including 3 or 4 different examples with that clause worded differently, like common examples. And that will help the AI do that job of identifying, is this clause a limitation? If so, I know that it's a limitation clause and I know the rules to apply. Part of the challenge that AI has that humans are able to deal with a little bit more naturally is identifying the right playbook rule to apply in each instance. And so doing this kind of teaching the AI to suck eggs using the playbook is a really good thing to do. And the more kind of examples you find that your use of AI might trip up on, yeah, include those in your playbook, update it and maintain it over time. If it's struggled to identify a particular form of wording as a force majeure clause, include that in your playbook as an example, and that will improve your outputs in future. So yeah, more examples equals more context equals better output. You need to do a bit more with AI about defining the logic for review outcomes. What do I mean by that? Is basically what happens next. It's certainly in human designed playbooks that are designed to work with humans. Traditionally, you would get away with just saying, this is fine, this is not fine. And actually, what was implied by that was that you need to negotiate, or you need to escalate, or you need to reject a position that is telling you something that doesn't comply with your playbook. But actually, AI is very bad at inferring implied instructions. And so I would encourage you to be very deliberate with what is the step when, on this particular point, you fall short of a fallback position. Do you want the AI to push and negotiate for a fallback position? If so, which position? Do you want the AI to push for a preferred position? If so, which one? And how often and how many times? Or do you just want the AI to flag it? Do you want it to flag for a human to intervene and make the decision? Either way, you need to tell the AI what to do, and your opportunity to do that is in the playbook. This is a really useful tip. Keep playbook rules really what I call atomic. Break down each rule to cover just one basic concept. Humans, because we are extremely well evolved and have amazing brains, we can tend to handle multiple concepts being mashed together in one rule. So you might, for a human playbook, have one topic that is liability, right? And you can include in that all sorts of things, all of which have their own different requirements and different rules. I would advise you not to bunch too much stuff together in one rule when you're planning to work with AI. And the reason for that is a couple of things. So one is the AI may just struggle to differentiate between one part of the rule and another part of the rule. The second reason is that actually increases the tunability and the auditability of why something has gone wrong. So if your rules are all bunched together and you've got one very long rule for liability, if something goes wrong, it's very hard to understand where the AI's reasoning fell down. If your rule relating to liability is atomic, so broken down to things like customer liability cap, vendor liability cap, indemnification, excluded losses, that kind of level, if the review breaks and something goes wrong, it's much easier to identify the very specific rule that caused that to go wrong. And that auditability is extremely important to the job of improving your playbook and improving whichever system it is you're using to make it work much better. Standardized rule labels. I think lawyers are generally quite good at this. So if you mean the same thing, say the same thing, rule to live by as a lawyer, but do pay particularly close attention to it when you're building playbooks that are designed for AI to use. I strongly advise adopting a very consistent taxonomy and a standardized structure for your rules. One of the things you can do to aid machine readability of your playbook rules is to use what I've done here in the example, which is to use what are called XML tags. And XML tags are basically these kind of structuring labels that have a beginning and an end, and they will help the AI identify, for example, where rule one ends and rule two begins, or where topic one ends within rule one and where topic two begins in rule one. And if you label this kind of thing deliberately and in this kind of XML format, you can make your playbook extremely structured and extremely easy for AI to read. The other thing it allows you to do is to modularize. So modularization basically allows you to reuse particular rules and particular topics across multiple playbooks. And eventually you may end up in a position where you only have to update those in one place, right? So you can reuse the same customer liability cap rule across your SaaS vendor contracts, your products, your physical goods contracts, and all of that. So very handy. And we've got some examples in the handout that will come around after this as well. I would also encourage you to consider versioning and rule IDs. This is for the same auditability and traceability reason that I outlined above with the kind of granularity of rules. But rule IDs help identify why AI is making changes. So some specialist legal AI tools like Juro will show you the particular rule that is requiring them to make a change. But equally, if you're using ChatGPT or you're using Claude, you can ask it to explain why it made a particular change. And having a rule ID will really help you do that. For example, you might call governing law rule 1 GL-01. That would be very useful if you were in a position where something had gone wrong with your governing law markup using AI and you just asked ChatGPT, said, why did you make this change? And if it referred back to GLO1, you then know exactly where the problem might be in the prompt or the problem might be in your playbook. So versioning and rule IDs are very useful for that auditability. Versioning IDs work on a similar principle. So you might have V1, V1.1, V1.2, whatever. But at least you might identify if you've made a change where that change has made an output worse. You have the ability to roll it back, right, and work out exactly what was the problem, and then try again with a new version. And then this tip is to optimize for the system that's using your playbook. You might find that certain formats and certain instructions work really well with general purpose AI tools like Gemini, like Claude, like ChatGPT, and other structures and systems work really well with a specific legal AI vendor tool. Really great systems make this easy. This is going to be one of my very few product shout outs for Juro, but the team has just released this kind of playbook converter where you can actually upload an existing playbook you might have in docx, and it automatically converts that into a kind of structured, modularized format that you can use in Juro. But you might find that whichever tool you're using, the provider of that tool might have specific requirements for how your rules are structured. It's worth doing that, particularly if you're going to be with that provider for a very long time. And it's really worth investing time in structuring it to work really well. I think one of the challenges I see with customers quite a lot is they might come in and say either they haven't got a playbook, right? That's a very difficult position to be in when you haven't written down what it is you want the AI to do. Or they might say, you know what, my playbook's in a completely kind of bespoke format to my business. What can I do here? Like, this is our solution for dealing with that problem, but it's worth talking to your provider to work out whether there's a particularly optimized way to format your playbook. You might also ironically find that general purpose AI tools are very good at doing a first cut of that restructuring. If you had a table format playbook, you might go to ChatGPT and say, I need to put this into paragraphs in plain text with XML tags structured as follows. Can you help me do that? And you might find you get a very decent first start at doing that. And then I think it's really important to track performance of your playbook, particularly accuracy and things like that with AI, but then to use that to optimize further. I think we spoke a bit earlier about finding the reason why you were doing a playbook in the first place and then working out whether you were furthering that reason or getting further away from it. Similar with kind of AI playbooks, work out which rules move the needle and which need work. So you might look at things like percentage of AI suggestions you're accepting, speed of AI review. Is it taking an hour to come back with a markup? Is that useful? Or percentage of issues that manage to be resolved by AI without human intervention. You might also still look at overall metrics. Am I getting faster or slower as a result of using AI? Or am I getting faster or slower as a result of using this playbook? Those things are very useful things to track. If things aren't working, it might indicate that you need to make a change or to try and experiment with something else. The good news at the end of this is that really none of this is future proof. And as a kind of AI contract automation vendor, I can only say sorry. I think that so playbooks are incredibly important in the successful operation of a human-led legal team. They are also, for the time being, incredibly important in the way that AI tooling responds to legal tasks. So at the moment, the vast majority of tools out there will require you to tell AI what to do at some level. That I don't think is going to remain the state of technology for years and years. So I think that these things are well worth doing because they help you refine your view of your own standard terms. They might help you refine your view of negotiation on vendor contracts. And they will also make you much, much quicker and much more efficient in the short to medium term. Long term, I would expect to see the market move in a different direction. I think you will start to see systems that become much, much more contextually aware of your negotiations and the way you negotiate. In 2 years' time, you might be using a tool that is aware of how you have negotiated particular points on particular contracts in the past. And actually, it might look at your playbook and say, you know what? I can see that you're not complying generally with this rule. And in fact, you've proposed this compromise solution on 8 occasions. Would you like to use that again here? And should we update the playbook to comply with that? I think that's really where it's going. I don't think anyone's quite there yet, but what it means for playbooks in the longer term, I think is still up in the air. Yeah, playbooks may be on the way out, but they may not be. I wanted to leave you before we enter the Q&A with maybe 3 key takeaways that I hope are useful in if you're struggling through a playbook project at the moment, or if you're thinking about embarking on your first playbook, or if you've got existing playbooks and you want to make them fit for the AI era. I hope that there's 3 points that came across relatively clearly over the last nearly an hour. So the first is that playbooks take time to perfect, but don't wait for that perfection to start seeing value. I think the point I made about shipping an imperfect playbook quickly being much more valuable than waiting to do what we call waterfall shipping, waiting for everything to be ready and then leaping over the edge. That second way is rarely the way to do things properly and to make sure that your playbook is functional and optimized for your business. The second is to treat playbooks like operating systems, not documents. So do that process of shipping, iterating, and operationalizing. They're not a static thing that sits in some dusty intranet page somewhere. They need to be brought to life and used, loved, and maintained. And then finally, update your playbooks for the AI era, make them readable and usable by machines. That's, I think, going to become table stakes for a modern legal function over the next, in fact, it already nearly is, but over the next few months. I think if you are not in a world where you are starting to think about how that work could be done or assisted by AI, you are probably at the stage where you're starting to fall a little bit behind. So yeah, think about kind of tips that I've shared and see if there are things that you can do that are quick wins that might start to make your playbooks ready for using AI. And the final question I'm going to leave it on is whether we're at the beginning of the end for playbooks. Maybe we are, but in the meantime, it can't hurt to have a great one to help your team function highly efficiently and to offload as much work out of your team as possible. That's all I was going to say. Kate, I think we've got some time for Q&A.
Yeah, and we do have a couple of questions. We had one question that you answered already, but we have a couple more. So, someone asked, when distributing a legal playbook widely to non-legal team members, like sales, for example, how do you practically manage and mitigate the risk of inadvertently waiving attorney-client privilege? And they asked, particularly concerning internal distribution and potential discovery in future litigation.
So that's a really good question. So the short answer is it will depend very strictly on the jurisdiction in which you're operating. So privilege is one of those things that the rules will be very different for me as an English lawyer as they will for many of you as various qualified in various US jurisdictions. It's something you need to think about a little. I think that I would say if I was looking at this with my English law hat on, which is quite similar to a lot of the rules in a lot of the US states, I would think about who needs to know this stuff to benefit from the advice that's in it, and I would limit access to that. I wouldn't be like publishing it for the whole company to see, but if your sales team need to use it to operate, then make it available to them. I think the other thing to say is that it's worth just weighing up the two risks, right? So one is a risk that your playbook might become discoverable in litigation, and that's definitely a risk. But the other is a risk of slowing down, a risk of your team becoming burned out and failing to do the stuff they need to do to agree consistent, properly risk managed positions. And I think a lot of teams, particularly on the kind of lower value, more commoditized agreements that playbooks are really suitable for, might take the view that maybe a little more risk on the discoverability side is probably worth the trade-off. But again, it's a very individual question for both your jurisdiction and your business and working out your risk appetite.
I love when we have a question that lawyers can answer with, it depends.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the other question we've gotten is how different are your playbooks now due to AI support? So are the changes substantive or just focused on prompts and formatting for the LLM as you highlighted earlier?
So it's a great question. Formative, very different. So my playbooks now live in Juro, which is the thing I use to mark up most vendor contracts. And so they are modularized kind of blocks in the Juro system, but that just happens to be where I live. And I have a philosophical belief that you absolutely should not maintain one thing in more than one place because it's just a drain of resources to try and do it in multiple places. So my playbooks for commercial contracts live in Duro. That's what I use. I use AI review for first pass of most vendor and sales contracts these days. That's where they live. Substantively, what do they look like? How are they different? They're becoming a lot more literal. They're becoming a lot more structured in the way that I've described. And actually, weirdly, they start to become, they have these little kind of anachronisms in them that develop as a result of testing and using them with AI. I can give you a slightly amusing example, which is that there was one rule I had in my confidentiality agreement playbook that was really, I really just could not get AI to apply it. And I included in it basically a threat. So I told it includes a prompt that says you the system have 3 lives. Every time you refuse to mark up in line with this playbook, you lose a life. And it actually fixed the problem. And so you end up with these weird anachronisms in your rules. Yeah, there's definitely things that I've spoken about in this presentation that are in my playbooks now substantively. Form wise, they live in Duro. And then there's those weird quirks that we're going to start to see a few more of as we all become roboticized in the next few years.
I see that is something that I would never think to do. That is such a great, it's amazing that fixed it. I love that. And then we have a little follow-up question here, which is, do you need to have a playbook for human eyes for ease of use and then a version for AI, like the AI version not so easy, then also to be used by the humans and vice versa?
Again, I'm philosophically opposed to having more than one version of the same thing. So I tend to try to make my playbooks readable by both. Yeah, to the extent you're including weird and wacky XML tags, you might want to think about the spacing on the page, for example, to make it actually readable by a human.
Right.
But I tend to keep them in one place. And actually, one of the beauties of kind of generative AI is that it encourages natural language in the form of the prompt, right? So you can actually talk to the AI in the way you would talk to a junior team member or to someone else in a sales team or wherever it is that you're talking to. So yeah, I tend to have one that is as far as possible optimized for both. I'm not sure necessarily that the weird things about threatening it are necessarily that useful for junior team members, but they know why.
No, we don't need more pressure. Our associates don't need more pressure. And Andrew asked, what are your thoughts on building new playbooks by having AI review first pass reviews of the agreements in scope? He said this often gives you actual fallbacks, but others in legal might have heartburn documenting that in an official playbook.
Yeah, it's pretty cool, right? Isn't it? It's like I often had this debate about whether playbooks are they like an expression of principle and like dogma, or are they meant to reflect the reality of how you actually negotiate? I have definitely always been historically the former, right? So I've thought about it at like an almost like academic level and kind of thought, okay, what is it that I want my positions to be and how and why, and thought them out. One of the things I found with that approach and then being embedded with this team of AI engineers at Duro was actually the reality of how I negotiated didn't necessarily reflect my thoughts when I was sat on my own drafting a playbook. I think, to be honest, it's probably a balance of the two. I think that and actually that kind of way of getting a general purpose AI tool to review a negotiation that you've done already and work out what your principles are from that is quite a neat way of shortcutting that process. But either way works. The way I found it was sitting there reviewing AI markups against my playbook and realizing that actually I didn't really intend what I wrote, and having that process of being taught by the AI to refine what it was I was asking for. But I could see how it would work coming the other way as well. So looking at actual empirical data and then using that to inform how you build your positions.
Thank you, Michael. Please feel free to pop up your Juro slide here. And while you do that, I will also put a little poll up here if anyone is interested in learning more about Juro, since it can help you with some of these things. Please let us know. And we're getting lots of great feedback about what a great presentation this was. As always, you knocked it out of the park here. So thank you so much. Anything you would like to promote the Juro community here?
If you've had fun and you want to talk more about playbooks, we have a community of over 2,000 lawyers, generally at scaling businesses, but also a lot of large corporates as well. If you want to go to a community that is relatively not salesy and more interested in finding ways to do in-house legal better, do sign up at juro.com/community. Thanks, Kate.
Yes, and please also go register for our community and our upcoming events. We have a bunch of events this week, so go sign up for those as well. And once again, thank you so much to Michael for his fantastic insights, and thank you to Juro for sponsoring us. And we hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.